Good afternoon, class. We're going to spend just a few minutes reviewing some of the kind of the pertinent information that I think you might need as you're taking your quiz number two. And this one probably won't be as, as lengthy as some have been, but we'll jump in here and then kind of go through the review process. And first thing, and we've talked about it in some of the earlier chapters, uh, that markets are basically organizations that bring buyers and sellers together. If you think about, um, well, think about healthcare markets. So you've got providers on one side, you've got health plans on the other side of this financial coin, and then uh, so providers are the ones that are generating the goods and services in the healthcare environment. Health plans are taking those goods and services as a market, they're bundling them together, and then they are turning around and selling them to employer groups. Employer groups all over the Nashville community are buying goods and services from United, Aetna, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Tennessee, and the healthcare market as being facilitated by the health plans are bringing the buyers, the employer groups that are trying to buy goods and services in the healthcare market for their employees and the providers who are selling them. So health plans are bringing them together. You have the same thing in financial markets. New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, S&P 500, commodity markets, Chicago Board of Trade, Mercantile Exchange in Chicago, um, think about, um, I think it's over there on Rosa Parks. You've got that farmers market. That farmers market, it's a market that is bringing buyers and sellers together. You have, sellers of fruits and vegetables. I think they sell plants. They've got some craft things around, especially Thanksgiving, Christmas, and that, and it's also got a food court. But the farmers market are bringing buyers and sellers together, and they are facilitating those transactions. And that kind of launches into what we're talking about now, what we're talking about the model for supply and demand. And the model for supply and demand is like a good economic model. It's simplified. So it takes a very complex world and the model simplifies it down to a set of assumptions that allows economists to study either individual markets, global markets, the economic forces in general, but it brings it in and it distills it down into a model that is easy to understand, easy to work with, and it minimizes, again, go back to the pillars and the self-interest of the economist, it minimizes a lot of the complexity that they're having to work within. And the economic world is definitely it's definitely not a perfect world. So they're trying to minimize those imperfections. And some of the parameters around your model for supply and demand, many buyers and sellers. Sellers have a homogeneous product. That means, there's no differentiation in the products. Um, uh, Mobile device is a mobile device. So they're not differentiating between iPhones and some of these other producers of mobile devices. There's freedom of price movements, no government regulations, laws that are going to inhibit price movements. Um, and again, there's no government intervention. And, it's the freedom to seek best deals. So buyers and sellers, because there are many buyers and sellers, you've got competition. And among buyers and sellers, you can reach out and negotiate the best deals. Demand is what we want to talk about. Demand, it's the desire to seek a product and the willingness to pay for that product. All other things equal, and this is important, all other things equal, price is going to be the ultimate driver. And remember, when we're talking about economic models, economists are notorious for invoking ceteris paribus, which is Latin for all other things equal, all other things unchanged. And so they are holding a lot of the external forces constant as they study these economic models. And what will impact demand for a good or service is going to be, and again, well, let me step back. There are two concepts that students sometimes struggle with. So if you look at the model for supply and demand, on the vertical, you've got price. On the horizontal, you've got quantity. Demand is downward sloping because the law of demand says at lower prices, more quantity is demanded. So as price goes down on your vertical, because it's a negative slope, you're going to get more quantity demanded. So as you move along that demand curve, you're looking at quantity demanded. You're looking at quantities. If something happens to shift demand, now we're talking about that demand curve is downward sloping. And if something happens to shift demand or to change the demand at all price levels, remember, downward sloping, more quantity is demanded at given prices. But if you talk about shifting that demand curve at all price levels, demand curve either shifts up and out to the right. If there's an increase in demand, if there's a decrease in demand, it's going to shift down and to the left. And things that cause demand to shift are price, buyer preferences. When we say buyer preferences, buyers have preferences. McDonald's over Burger King, Dunkin' Donuts over Starbucks, prices of related goods. So if you're in the grocery store shopping and you're standing in front of the soda selection and you've got Pepsi and you've got Coke, prices between those two related goods are going to drive the demand on the buyer side of the house. Buyer's income. If you've got more income, especially more disposable income, you could effectively shift that demand curve out for goods and services. In a recession or in an area where high inflation, especially if you're among the senior population, your disposable income is not, because of inflation, it's not what it was 2 years ago. And so your demand for goods and services may be shifting downward, and enough senior population could impact the shift that demand curve either out or downward. Demographic factors. Think about it. The older our population gets, wasn't too long ago that I read an article, I can't remember what it was, in Barron's or Wall Street Journal, and it talked about the significant increase in mobile and they call them toy haulers, but kind of Airstream type. So either these mobile homes that you hook behind your pickup truck, you see them going down the road, or those self-propelled, campers that you see driving in. And elderly populations are buying more and more of those and either turning them into permanent homes, or they're just driving around the country, and they're driving around the country as the seasons change. So they've seen an uptick in that as the demographic population gets older. As the demographic population gets older, they're linking it to increases in the demand for cruises, especially Caribbean cruises. And then lastly, things that are going to shift that demand curve, you're talking about buyer expectations. Think about you're going to buy a new car, and you decide, well, if I can wait till the fall, maybe October, November, when the models change, then maybe I can get a great price on a last year's model car. So the demand based on buyer expectation is going to impact shifts in that demand curve. You see a similar thing with appliances, especially household appliances, especially kitchen appliances, because a lot of these manufacturers are going to increase the price at the first of the year. So you'll see these ads that says, price of refrigerator is going to go up 7%. And first of January the 1st, and you'll see a kind of an influx of individuals going in and buying those refrigerators maybe in December because they don't want to wait till January and be tagged with that 7% increase in price. So these are what they call demand shifters, and the text will talk about demand shifters. And any one of these or any combination of these will cause that demand curve to either shift out if it's an increase, or to shift downward and to the left if it's a decrease. And again, when we're talking about the demand curve, moving along that demand curve, you're talking about the quantity demanded. If the demand curve shifts out or down, now we're talking about increases or decreases in demand. And if you think about supply, it's a similar concept on supply. Supply is tied back to, remember, the three pillars of economic thought: opportunity cost, self-interest, decisions at the margin. So buyers are making a lot of decisions at the margin, so there's going to impact demand. Opportunity cost is going to impact, it impacts both supply and demand, but especially self-interest impacts the supply side, because self-interest, why do firms produce goods and services? They produce goods and services to generate a profit. And so self-interest on the supply side is going to be driven by profits. And again, remember, profit, when you're talking about the function of profit, it's going to be revenue minus cost. And so if you can increase the revenue and decrease your cost, you're going to increase your profit. So on the supply side, on the producer side, or on the seller side, you're talking about looking at price, which is going to drive both revenue and cost. You're looking at cost, and you're looking at number of sellers. So all three of those are going to impact when it comes to decisions on the supply side, and shifts among those, either movements up and down the supply. And so demand's going negative, supply is going to be in a positive direction, because the law of supply says at higher prices, more goods and services are going to be provided, going to be produced, going to be sold. So movement along the demand curve is quantity demanded. Movement along that supply curve is going to be quantity supplied. And a shift in the supply is going to be, if it's a decrease in supply is going to be upward like this. If it's an increase in supply, that supply curve is going to move downward. So out and in on demand, up and down on the supply. And again, supply similar to demand, all other things unchanged, price is going to be the driver. And similar to demand, where we had our demand shifters, you also got supply shifters. Cost of inputs. What happens? They're talking about increasing minimum wage cost. What do you think that's going to do to the labor cost on supply? And what could it impact the shift in a supply curve? So especially if you're in California, where I think the last time I saw something, or at least the last time I heard the talking heads on TV, they were talking about fast food minimum wage going to something like $25 or something. Think what that's going to do, not only to the cost of producing fast food, but think about what that could potentially do to shift the supply curve on the fast food market. You've got technology. If technology changes, let's say technology increases. If technology increases, becomes more efficient. Remember, go back to your factors of production. So if technology, the little black box, becomes more efficient, it is lower cost for firms to bring inputs into the black box or the technological process and generate output. So that's going to have an impact depending on what's happening on the technology. returns from alternatives. If if they decide that there are alternative products that they can produce using the factors of production, it's going to increase, or it's going to impact the supply curve on the current products that they're producing. And it'll also impact the supply curve if they decide to switch and generate additional goods and services that are alternatives to what they're producing now. Seller expectations. Seller expectations are constantly looking at, what's the economy going to do? What's the larger economy going to do, and how's that going to impact their supply decisions? Natural events, especially when it comes to agricultural commodities. Think what a drought, think what a hailstorm does to a corn crop or a wheat crop or a soybean. It's going to significantly reduce the supply of those agricultural commodities and going to raise the price for those goods and services to everybody. Similar thing if you've got a hurricane or a tornado and it comes through and it causes destruction. Think what that does to shift the supply and demand curve, especially for contractors or demolition experts. Or I had some tree work done in my yard this past week, and the crew that came out and took down a couple of dead trees for me, they were talking about as soon as they finished my job, jumping in the truck and heading to the Northeast and kind of follow that winter storm, because they knew they would need individuals with the expertise to help clear out down trees and help work on the power lines. So all of these natural occurrences or natural events could impact the supply. And then you've got the number of sellers. More sellers, in theory, more supply. So if number of sellers increases, you've got that supply curve is going to increase. If the number of sellers decide to leave a market, and we'll get into, we got into it a lot when we were talking about economic rents on the macro side. But if you have sellers that leave a market, then all other things equal, that supply curve is going to shift up and to the left. Again, when you're talking about, remember Adam Smith, and we talked about Adam Smith and the invisible hand, that's going to drive markets, supply and demand, that's going to drive those markets to equilibrium. It's the forces of the market that drive it to equilibrium. If you've got, surplus, if you've got shortages, those natural market forces are going to drive supply and demand to a new equilibrium price. And then the authors talk for a few minutes about price controls. And price controls are basically in place, and it's through government intervention when the government has a perception of market failure. And government, when they set price controls, they base it on normative. So policymakers are basing the implementation of price controls on normative judgments. And remember, normative judgments, economists talk in positive judgments. Here, positive judgments, this is the way the market is. Policy makers, and especially government entities, base decisions on normative judgments, and they are saying this is the way that the world should be. This is the way that markets should act. And government sets price controls not only based on these normative judgments, but to shift its equitable solutions. So they're trying to redistribute wealth. They're trying to stabilize income streams, especially when you're talking about agricultural commodities, or you're talking about, let's say, a price floor, or especially on agricultural commodities, or a price floor when we're talking about minimum wage. And that's all minimum wage is. It's a price floor. They're doing that to stabilize income streams. When you're talking about, price ceilings, and we're talking about, rent control and things like that. Now they're talking about redistributing wealth. But in both cases, they're trying to drive a more equitable solution or their perception of a more equitable solution. And we'll go back and when we're talking about it, and the text spent a fair amount of time talking about price controls, and price floors are there to basically, again, produce these stable income streams for the sellers because it's unlawful to drop a price below whatever the price floor is. It's and on minimum wage, so if you've got a price floor of $6 on a bushel of corn, if you're not supposed to be able to drop, it's unlawful to drop that price of corn below $6. If you're talking about minimum wage as a price floor, it's supposed to be unlawful to hire individuals below minimum wage. And again, a lot of price floors, you're talking about agricultural products, you're talking about minimum wage. Those are the two things that you typically think about, price floors. And basically, well, let me back up. Not only are you talking about price floors there, if you are in a negotiation process, so you're in a negotiation process, and let's say you have a used car to sell. So it's your car, you're the seller, you establish in the negotiation process, you establish that price floor. That is the lower limit of that negotiation process. It's the price that you are not willing to go below. Let's say that you think your car is worth $2,500, but you decide there's some negotiation in there, and you're not going to go below $2,000. Let's say the buyer comes in and the buyer decides, your car is just not worth $2,500. Maybe $2,400 gets it. And so they are setting the price ceiling. So you set the price floor at $2,000. The buyer sets it at $2,400. And that's the price that individual is not going above. And so the negotiation takes place, and you decide to sell your car at $2,250. So that's the negotiation. You don't have to go down to $2,000. The buyer doesn't have to pay $2,400, and everybody goes away happy. And again, on price ceilings, as we've talked in the past, it's rent controlled is where you typically see price ceilings. It's unlawful to go above the price ceiling. And again, in a negotiation process, that establishes the upper limit of that negotiation process. Unfortunately, when it comes to government price controls, no matter what the ulterior motive is, the government just can't get it right for a number of factors, but the government has an extremely difficult job in getting things right when it comes to redistributing wealth, implementing normative judgments, setting price controls, whether it's a price floor or price ceiling. The government's just not very efficient, and it usually, I can't say usually, in some cases, it ends up with a situation that is worse than it was before the government got in and tried to change the way the situation was. And then the text spends a few minutes talking about taxes. Governments need taxes for one reason, that's to operate. Federal government, the majority of it, they're going to get theirs through excise tax, through personal income tax. If you're a state government, it's state income tax. It's to some extent excise taxes too. But if you're a local government, whether you're a city or a county government, you're going to be driving your revenue to operate the government through either sales tax or property taxes. So that's kind of how it all breaks out. As a graduate student at Ohio State, I was taxed to death. I paid federal income taxes, paid the state of Ohio income taxes, because Ohio State was within the city limits of Columbus. I paid a city tax to Columbus. I lived in one of the outlying suburbs in Westerville, and I had to, because I lived in Westerville, I had to pay income tax on Westerville, and then on top of all of that, because we were in Franklin County, I paid taxes to Franklin County. So depending on where you are, and if you are located in state of Tennessee or Texas or Florida, Nevada, state of Washington, maybe one of the Dakotas or some other states, maybe you don't pay state income tax, and it is a boost to your disposable income because you have an income advantage, especially from a disposable income perspective, over individuals. So you're in Tennessee, you've got an advantage over somebody living and working in Kentucky. You've got the advantage over people, in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. So because you have no state income tax. Now you may have a higher sales tax, or there may be some excise tax, or maybe a differentiator on property taxes, but from a state income tax perspective, you have an advantage living and working there in Tennessee. And if whether it's a state or local government, if you're taxing sellers, what typically happens is there is a decrease in the supply of a good or service. Remember, taxes, cost on sellers, supply shifter, ties it all back together. If you tax on buyers, there is typically a decrease in demand for good or service. Again, that's one of the demand shifters. You're going back to price on a demand shifter. And if there is a general tax on a good or service, the buyer pays a higher price, the seller receives a lower price. And the differential in there goes into the pocket of the government. And I think that's going to conclude the review of for quiz number 2. And quiz number 2, again, quiz number 1 was chapters 1 and 2. Quiz number 2 is going to be chapters 3 and 4. And I want to thank everybody for joining. And I will, as I add midterm and quizzes and finals to the process, I'll continue to make these review videos. Thanks for joining.